Hi everybody, this is a video for Chris Smith, who have requested that I read a bit more from this book by Christina Dorsini, who is an art historian and also the daughter of Osvaldo Meneghello, who is the maestro craft artisan extraordinaire behind the famous Il Meneghello publishing house for various artistic tarot decks, including this one here, decks. And so if the entirety of this book is really, from what I can see, has been approached from an art historical perspective, but when discussing the images, these information are highly relevant in my opinion, even if you are not particularly interested in the art history of these images. However, the opening remark, I thought, might bore some people unless you have a particular interest in art history, in particular the art history around this particular deck, which apparently potentially is not by Mantegna and apparently potentially really not quite tarot. So here we go. So if you are, before I start, if you're not particularly interested in art history, I would like to invite you to click off right now, and maybe I'll talk to you some other time. Also, before I go, I've mentioned in my other video that the English is quite awkward. So what I'll do is when I read directly from the book, I'll put the pencil like this, and when I have to stop and perhaps recap in terms of what I think Christina Dorsini is trying to say, if I do need to, I don't know if I do need to at all, I'll do this, and that's me talking, and then when I do that, I'm reading out of the book again. So here we go. The Mantegna Tarot, preserved at Visconti Castle in Pavia, was made using Burin and greenish ink. It consists of 50 cards composing a book, 200 by 145 millimeters each. Il Meneghello published these extraordinary cards to let the world know how many splendors Italy has, even if they are not so famous as British Museum version in London or National Libraries in Paris. Still, the Mantegna Tarot is very different, as it has several important details and clearly Mantegna physiognomy. I would like to start talking about my dissertation, which is better to call quote-unquote journey, in order to discover the fascinating story hidden in these extraordinary cards. The Mantegna Tarot is perceived more as a didactic play than traditional tarot. Actually, the Mantegna Tarot deck is really different from traditional tarot. First of all, for the number of cards, and then for its iconography. And then there is a footnote after that, so that's me talking. There is a footnote at the end of iconography, which I'll read out now. Arthur M. Hind, in his treatise written in 1938, explained how many several connections exist with traditional tarot regarding the iconography and clothing of some characters. The Mantegna Tarot represents a didactic play in which the player has a path to travel. Indeed, the deck consists of 5 sections or decades, each one consisting of 10 engravings, which follow a hierarchical structure from man to God. The sections are Condition of Man, or E, the Muses and Apollo, or D, the Sciences and the Arts, C, the Ethical and Cosmological Principles, B, the Planets and the Stars, A. So it goes from the lowest, that's me talking, so it goes from the lowest to the highest, starting from E, D, C, B, A, Conditions of Man, the Muses and Apollo, the Sciences and the Arts, the Ethical and Cosmological Principles, and then the Planets and the Stars. The lowest condition is represented by the beggar. The most spiritualized is represented by the Pope. This was the order thought for the universe by the medieval Christian theology. The influence of the humanism changed the concept of this order to such an extent that the Muses and some pagan divinities have much importance here and become intermediaries between God and men. 2 different prints exist. The first set was engraved with more precision and fineness, whose numbers 1 to 10 are represented by letter E. The other one is more inaccurate, and the numbers 1 to 10 are represented by the letter S. So this one here that we have by Il Meneghello is the E series, not the S series. So this one here, the first decades here, conditions of man here, is indicated by the letter E, the first 10, and the other set, the first 10, is indicated by the letter S. So our current one from Il Meneghello is the E series and not the S series. The S series, according to Christina Dorsini, is more refined. It's less refined, It's less refined. There are many disputes regarding which one of the original set, even if someone thinks that both may be part of the same set. The author of the S series did not take care of details, even if he showed freedom and realism in his illustrations. He showed more sensitivity thanks to the beauty of the shape. Furthermore, he enhanced the space in his composition. One of the main characteristics is his way of engraving, which is not so regular to such an extent that it may be from the Florentine school. So I think what Christina Dorsini is saying here is that the S series, which is not this one, which is the other one, the other copy that exists, she estimated that the artist behind the S series to be from the Florentine school due to the characteristic that she explained just now, that she outlined, which is, it says here, there seemed to be more freedom and realism in the illustration of the S series. There is more sensitivity to beauty and shape, and it seems like the composition of the spaces have been enhanced somehow. It seems to me that she's saying that the characteristic of the Florentine school seems to be a bit more flamboyant. So I'm going to continue reading. Next paragraph. By contrast, the author of the E series, which is this one here, thanks to his way of drawing with his rounded shapes and his swollen folds, showed a strong affinity with the Ferrara school. Furthermore, there is something, meanwhile, that recalls Andrea Mantegna's style, especially regarding the faces. By contrast, other elements recall Venetian production. So I think what she's saying is that when the other series, the S series, has a bit of Florentine style to it with a lot of flamboyance and a lot of, in terms of the way the scenes are set up and the way shapes are depicted, the author of the current series, which is the E series, she proposed belonged to the Ferrara school of art with some elements of, with a lot of Venetian element in the deck as well. Back to reading from the book. The technique of engraving belonging to the E series, this one here, supports the idea that the author was Venetian, thanks to the clear incision and the regular system used for the shadows, as well as to the presence of 3 characters named in Venetian dialect. They are the servant, the doge, and the artisan. In light of the fact that these relevant differences exist, the focus is still on the features belonging to Mantegna cards, which shows unequivocally all those characteristics of E series described above. Looking at them carefully, images strike for the way the faces are represented, even if some figures more than others. And then there's a note here. It is likely that Mantegna made some changes just for some characters or in some parts of the cards. So I will continue by rereading that sentence. In light of the fact that these relevant differences exist, the focus is still on the features belonging to Mantegna cards, which shows unequivocally all those characteristics of the E series described above. Looking at them carefully, images strike for the way the faces are represented, even if some figures more than others show more elegance thanks to their dresses and the focus on the landscape, but first of all to the tendency to the classicism and the antique period. So I think what she's saying is that she's building up a thesis where she's saying that this is by Mantegna. This has a Venetian element to it due to the naming of the three cards, the servant, the doge, and the artisan, because it used Venetian dialect for those three words. But also stylistically, she said this is more of a Ferrara style with that sort of big, voluptuous, voluminous figures. If you recall the Solabusca, you know, that sort of almost very beefy, almost chunky characterization of the human shapes. But also, she is arguing that a lot of the classically inspired elements in these cards is consistent with Mantegna's high interest and high knowledge in classical arts. Just going back to the book. Especially some faces recall directly Andrea Mantegna, and this opened to the possibility of his authorship, even if very disputed. So she is recognizing that the authorship of Mantegna for this deck is highly disputed, but she's proposing it in this case based on the fact that there's the Venetian dialect in the naming of three cards, the Ferrara style, the seemingly high element and knowledge of classical and antique arts, as in the Roman and Greek period, which typify the Renaissance artistic movement, harking back to Roman and Greek classical art, as well as the fourth element is the facial features, which she felt is highly consistent with Mantegna's style. And in the back of the book, there is an example of some of Mantegna's work. There it is, and a close-up of the same art. So this is by Mantegna, and this one here is a close-up of that figure over here, and she's pointing out to the facial features. As you can see why there's room for debate there, although you can see the resemblance in stylistic sort of in the aesthetic of the faces as well. So we go back to the front page. Mantegna was probably the first Italian author that understood the importance of engraving, even after many of his works were only printed by other artists, gaining an extraordinary distribution and celebrity. Using both burin and dry point, Mantegna was able to get extraordinary chiaroscuro effects, which make the drawing a relief. Mantegna was born in Venice in 1431. He attended the Squarcione school in Padua, and then he moved to Mantova in 1460, where he stayed, I think is what she's trying to say, until his death in 1506, and where he worked as a painter at Gonzaga court. Before and after working as a painter, he was always in movement. The 23rd of May in 1449, he was in Ferrara at the service of Leonello d'Este. There he created a work that has been lost, which represented a double portrait illustrating both Leonello and Folco di Filafora. It is not sure how long he stayed there, but it is undisputed that he had the possibility to see Pierro della Francesca's paintings and Fleming's ones, paintings which the Duke collected. Maybe he met Piero della Francesca himself and Rogier van der Weyden, which was in Italy at the same year and stayed at the Estense court between 1449 and 1450, where created a deposition for Leonello's apartments. Who created a deposition for Leonello's apartment is unclear from the sentence here, and I'm also wondering if I should Google this, whether this Fleming, Piero della Francesca's paintings and Fleming's, is Fleming a name of a painter, or is that supposed to say Flemish? Let me Google and I'll get back to you. I suspect that's supposed to read Flemish. I don't know. I could be wrong because I can't find any painter in that period under the name Fleming. Please feel free to correct me. Because I know that the 1400s is the start of a lot of Renaissance art around Italy and Flanders, and Flemish artists are beginning to bloom around about that period, if I recall my high school art history lessons correctly. So I'll continue to read from the book. Mantegna came back to Ferrara in 1450 until 1451 at service of Borso d'Este, for which painted Adoration of the Shepherds. And then there's a note at 5 here, oil on canvas painting 40 by 55.6 centimeters, 1450 to 1451, Metropolitan Museum of New York. This work shows a greater focus on reality derived by Flemish examples. So there's a Flemish influence there. I would like to focus on these two dates and these two stays in Ferrara, as it is likely, in my opinion, that during one of these periods Mantegna was asked to create a particular deck of cards, characterized by some specific elements. First of all, the 9 Muses of Studiolo di Belfiore, element that was widespread in 1447 thanks to Leonolo d'Este, a refined and sensitive patron, met also by Mantegna himself. And then there's a note in relation to the 9 Muses of Studiolo di Belfiore. The note here is that Noble Palace, where also Roger van der Weyden worked. The cards were probably made in 1450 to celebrate Borso d'Este, as he became Duke of Reggio and Modena, as well as Marquess of Ferrara. Overmore, it is possible to find in this card Mantegna's interests in antique times. Indeed, he was the greatest expert in Roman antiquities. The presence of classical and Sorry, I have to pause every time I cough just to spare you guys the coughing. And so, let me read that again. Overmore, it is possible to find in this card Mantegna's interest in antique times. Indeed, he was the greatest expert in Roman antiquities. The presence of classical and coeval sculpture characterized all of his production. Furthermore, he was the first classicist of painting, as he used the elements of classical world into his works. Besides, other Ferrara elements are present, as the landscapes which depicted how Ferrara was in that time, full of rivers reclaimed by Borso, wrongly seen as lagoons. During the Middle Ages, most of the Ferrara Valley was boggy, and only in the 15th century it was progressively reclaimed. The buildings characterizing the landscapes described above were the so-called castalderi. In 400, Este family committed to the widespread of castalderi near Ferrara, and especially in the eastern Po Valley. Most of the castalderi were reachable through a thick lattice of little rivers which were connected. The lattice characterized the Po River. Bel Riguardo was an example. As for other decks of cards, it is likely that after the first draft of Mantegna, the next copies, or even the realization, were made by the atelier of the court using carton. This extraordinary work belongs to Ferrara context during 1450, when astrology, astronomy, philosophy, and alchemy were important topics, thanks to Borso d'Este, to whom several treatises and works were dedicated. It is clear at this point that it was a very important cultural time where researchers were crucial. I don't quite understand that. An important historical period lived also by Ludovico Ariosto, Torquato Tasso, Matteo Bandello, and many famous Italian and Flemish painters. There were footnotes here. next to carton, it says, draft with the same dimension of the final work using charcoal or chalk, writing on a thick paper. And then next to the Ferrara context of 1450, this extraordinary work belongs to the Ferrara context. The footnote here says at the end of the book, it will be explained why I think the cards I'm talking about were made in Ferrara and by whom. And then footnote 9, next to, where is it? Footnote 10, after it says, thanks to Borso d'Este, astrology, astronomy, philosophy, and alchemy were important topics at the time, to whom several treatises and works were dedicated. That is Borso d'Este. It says here, during this period, Marsilio Ficino, 1433 to 1499, translated dialogues of Plato, the Aeneads of Plotinus, and wrote theology. This shows the focus on philosophical topics in Renaissance courts. So that's the end of that section, and a lot more information can be found online, and I will try to link some of them below. Bye for now.